Welcome back, March 2nd, 2021. Odd moment on Fox News this morning. They were interviewing Seth John, a soccer Paralympian who was removed from the U.S. Soccer Federation Athletes Council for dissenting in the federation's vote to repeal the requirement to stand for the national anthem. For what it's worth, John is a Paralympian due to injuries he sustained wearing our country's uniform in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were interviewing John and then interrupted one of his answers to convey breaking news, not to return to the interview. What was the breaking news they interrupted John's interview with? It was that Vernon Jordan, age 85, passed away. If you don't remember Vernon Jordan, he's been out of the news for some time. He was a civil rights lawyer and activist in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, but became even more famous or infamous for his role in the Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal. A friend of Bill Clinton's, he helped get jobs for Monica Lewinsky to pay her for her silence or to buy her silence over her affair with Bill Clinton. Was his death such breaking news that it required the interruption of an interview with a military hero figuratively standing up for the national anthem in his sport of soccer and getting fired for doing so? You be the judge. But back to Seth John a moment. Here was what he wrote on Twitter. I want to state that my positions are in no way representative of U.S. Soccer or the U.S. National Extended Team, USPNT. I will never apologize for the statements I made and will never bow down to the mob mentality of intimidation, bullying, or the social media warriors' Gestapo tactics. I'm embarrassed to represent a hypocritical federation that conducts a complete assault on diversity of thought without even seeking clarifying statements from me in their smear campaign. I'm embarrassed at the cowardice of so-called friends who bent over to the mob knowing very well the quality of my character in order to preserve their own image. The overwhelming support I received from a number of people with the Federation compared to the 30-plus death threats I received from the insignificant, rabid keyboard warriors was appreciated, but I implore you to speak publicly in your support in the future for those bold enough to challenge the status quo, and not just privately. Nothing I said was racist, and I've done more for people of color all over this planet at risk of my own life throughout the entirety of my 17-year career that the entire Athletes Council has done cumulatively, and I will continue to do so. The one point I will clarify, he continues, is that when I stated that a small percentage of people in our country who were responsible for the terrors of slavery hundreds of years ago, of which 400,000 plus men died to abolish under our nation's flag, I was in no way minimizing the horrors of slavery. I was simply illuminating the misplaced rage and squandered opportunities to bring to light the tens of millions of people who are enslaved today, more so than at any point in history. Persecuted people who I readily put my life on the line to recover from the predacious dregs who prey on them. I welcome any and all respectful debates, void of emotion, and I will gladly have an open dialogue publicly with anyone who is brave enough to place unwarranted labels on me from the safety of their mobile device. Well done, Mr. John. I guess I better understand now why so many people had so much of a problem with the word nationalism. Not white nationalism. Nobody on our side ever said that word or endorsed it. Indeed, the only person I know in politics who did use the phrase white nationalism endorsed Joe Biden, a leader of the Charlottesville March, who endorsed Joe Biden. That was Richard Spencer. No, Donald Trump and many of his votaries spoke simply of nationalism. And that word or phrase received a lot of condemnation as if it was soaked in racism or a dog whistle to racism. But the truth is, nationalism is what is at the heart of uniting any given people, and why the Star-Spangled Banner is also known as the National Anthem. So I get how, if you hate the idea of our nation, you would hate the word nationalism and the National Anthem. And those of us who think the Star-Spangled Banner worth standing for, never mind fighting for, as Seth John did, and now got fired for so doing. I think it's long past time for some remedial education for our national athletes, press, and social justice warriors. When you refuse to stand for, or when you condemn our national anthem because you think it pays tribute to a country founded on, based on, or supportive of slavery, you betray tremendous ignorance. It's hard to blame you, and I don't, for your ignorance, because it is learned ignorance. Well, it's taught and learned. It was taught to you that our country is not a great country, and part of that thesis comes from the fact that some of this country maintained and supported slavery. It's also learned because for too many of you, this is the attractive and sophisticated thing to believe, that our country is a lousy blight on the world, and in the words of Andrew Cuomo, was never that great. It's lousy history, as I say. It is true we were a house divided, as Lincoln put it, on the question of slavery in America. It didn't start that way, but it did become that way. As the Civil War became incipient, there were two different interpretations of our founding and moralities. One side thought our founding meant to extend slavery and that there was nothing wrong with it. One side thought our founding was meant to limit it, end it, and that it was a wrong that needed to be righted. And so we would, in Lincoln's words, become all the one thing or all the other. Those of us who won, the winning side, read the Constitution one way. The losing side read it another. And thus the house did fall. But so too did slavery. But what years and years of teaching has neglected to teach is that the opponents of slavery in America far outnumbered and were greater than the supporters of slavery. The Union had more states than the Confederacy. The Union won. We celebrate Abraham Lincoln and not Jefferson Davis, or at least we used to. The problem is that generation after generation of teaching has taught what is effectively the losing side interpretation of our founding that was embraced by the leaders of our Civil War, at least the Confederate side. Today we are taught the founding thought slavery a good thing. That's what Alexander Stephens and Jefferson Davis taught. As Jefferson Davis put it, quote, "We recognize the Negro as God, and God's book and God's laws and nature tell us to recognize him. Our inferior, fitted, expressed for servitude." Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and he said, God and God's book of laws in nature tells us to recognize him as expressed for servitude, the black man. Alexander Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy, and he put the founding in its history this way, quote, "The prevailing ideas entertained by Thomas Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, politically, and they rested upon that assumption of equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Our new government, the Confederacy, is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Got it? You can find people who think that the black person was built and meant for slavery in this country. It's just that they led the Confederacy, not the Union side. The Confederacy viewed Thomas Jefferson's words about equality as wrong. Roger B. Taney put it this way: the black man had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. People used to be taught that that was the worst Supreme Court case in history. Now the left seems to embrace that that's the teaching of the founding. Each and every one of those foregoing theories is what you hear about our founding today in America's classrooms. This is the view of our founding now, that slavery was seen to be a good thing. That is the view, if not the purpose, of the 1619 Project. There was another view, articulated most profoundly by the very man whose name was removed from a high school in San Francisco just last month, Abraham Lincoln. He would put things more like this, quote, "Wise statesmen as they were, they knew the tendency of prosperity to breed tyrants, and so they established these great self-evident truths that when in the distant future some man, some faction, some interest should set up the doctrine that none but rich men or none but white men were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, their posterity might look up again to the Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew the battle which their fathers began, so that truth and justice and mercy and all the humane and Christian virtues might not be extinguished from the land, so that no man would hereafter dare to limit and circumscribe the great principles on which the Temple of Liberty was being built. Abraham Lincoln said this: when Stephen Douglas says he boldly denies that the Declaration includes Negroes at all, I protest against that counterfeit logic. He said this: slavery is founded in the selfishness of man's nature, opposition to it in his love of justice. Repeal the Missouri Compromise, repeal all compromises, repeal the Declaration of Independence, repeal all past history. You still cannot repeal human nature. It still will be the abundance of man's heart that slavery extension is wrong. And he said this: our adversaries, the Confederate States, have adopted some declarations of independence in which, unlike the good old one penned by Jefferson, they omit the words all men are created equal. Why? They have adopted a temporary national constitution in the preamble of which, unlike our good old one signed by Washington, they omit we, the people, and substitute we, the deputies of the sovereign and independent states. Why? Why this deliberate pressing out of view the rights of men and the authority of the people? And Lincoln said this: now, my countrymen, if you have been taught doctrines conflicting with the great landmarks of the Declaration of Independence, if you have listened to suggestions which would take away from its grandeur and mutilate the fair symmetry of its proportions, if you have been inclined to believe that all men are not created equal in those inalienable rights enumerated by our Charter of Liberty, let me entreat you to come back. Return to the fountain whose waters spring close by the blood of the Revolution. Come back to the truths that are in the Declaration of Independence. Do not destroy that immortal emblem of humanity, the Declaration of American Independence. Close quote. Again, one side believed in the natural rights based on our common humanity as articulated in the Declaration of Independence, and as one side believed our Declaration of Independence was a lie. One side believed our Constitution was meant to embrace the first understanding, and one side believed it was meant to embrace the second. The side of the first in both cases was bigger than the side of the second. The side of the first in both cases prevailed and won the Civil War. And so today we arrive at a national pedagogy that instructs us in the rightness and morality and history of that second side, that second theory, the losing side, the losing theory. And our children are increasingly bombarded not just with that, but with the junk thought that leads them to believe an anthem to our nation is an anthem to slavery. It is not. It is an anthem to the greatest nation in the history of the world that has given more freedom to more people than any other country in history. Perhaps this is why in the past 20 years alone, black immigration to America has increased over 70%. What do those 5 million now African Americans know that the U.S. soccer team and Colin Kaepernick do not know? Something tells me the answer is a lot. It probably starts with the understanding that this country and its history should not be written by the side that lost, as it lost for a reason. And there are hundreds of thousands of dead who hallowed our ground to make it so. Turns out Abraham Lincoln was really wrong only about one thing. Turns out the world will forget what those men did there. I'm Seth Liebson. We'll be right back.